So, the part that you're really just looking over starts on 797 of McKay, and it's called The Global Migration Around 1900. So, the story is that there's a massive population explosion in Europe between 1700 and 1800, something to the ballpark of 188 million Europeans at the beginning of the century, 432 million by the end of the century. That's a massive increase in population, and we know why. We know that they're eating better. We know that their life expectancy is increasing. The bacterial revolution is going to play a big role in that. The average standard of living is going up because of industrialization. But that kind of population pressure in really a pretty condensed space, Europe is not that big, all right, started to put struggles on people. I mean, you're in regions where you're competing for maybe precious jobs, and it makes sense that in the time periods that you look at, like the 1840s, what did we say about the 1840s? Does anybody know about that decade? What was its nickname?
The Hungry 40s.
The Hungry 40s, okay? So when you're looking at, the time when there's a lot of Europeans that are leaving Europe looking for something else, oftentimes it's then, all right? Is that there was periods where either the 40s was a pretty tumultuous period for politics, and in Germany in particular, the German states, there was a lot of people that left in the 1840s, and then a lot of them were coming to the United States. Irish, obviously, big populations of Irish leaving in the 1840s. And then as you get towards the turn of the century, you did have some more economic distress, but there were other features that were involved, and you certainly look at different populations that were leaving. So Northern and Western Europeans tended to leave earlier, like the 1840s, 50s, 60s. It doesn't mean that they weren't coming continuously, but that the big periods of, like, say, United Kingdom people that were leaving to come to the United States, or Irish, Scots, Scandinavians, etc., they were leaving in the 1840s. Particularly, if anybody remembers their U.S. history, when the iron mines were discovered up in the upper reaches of Minnesota. I think they call it the Wasabi Range. Is that right? But yeah, there were large populations of Scandinavians that left looking for those jobs. And then we talked about the struggles that places like Austria-Hungary, the Balkans, Italy, and their economic struggles, especially post-unification Italy. And that helps explain why there was large contingents of Southern and Eastern Europeans that were leaving, looking for other places to go. And so there's a couple of maps that you should pay attention to, and one of them is, they're both on page, actually one's on 798, one's on 799, and it shows you like the time periods where there was massive immigration. And so you're looking at it like this, and the spikes tended to be around the turn of the century, like really the first couple of decades of the 1900s. Why would it make sense that right around 1914 there was massive exits from Europe to come to the United States or anywhere? World War I, yeah. Okay. What about if you were Jewish? When would you leave? Especially in the first couple of decades of the 1900s. But if you were in Eastern Europe or Russia and you were fleeing those pogroms, yeah, the largest exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe was in the first decade of the 1900s, and that's when we started to see anti-Semitism built into action. Those Russian pogroms, particularly the most difficult 10-year period was 1900 to 1910. All right. They also talk about just some of the key features, like who's leaving and why are they leaving. In a lot of cases it's economics. It's that there was another opportunity. They talked about Italian farmers in particular that were dealing with really pretty rough growing seasons, that were able to find a way of making decent money by getting on a ship that might be heading to South America. and then working the growing seasons in South America, like Brazil and other places, and then they would come back. And they might be able to pocket an extra $800 a year by doing that. Okay? If there were Jews leaving Russia, they're not coming back. Okay? That's not the kind of situation where they're like saying, "Oh, I'm just following the growing seasons." No, you're fleeing political, cultural persecution. And that's well enough to suggest that when they leave, they stay left. All right. And then you look at the destinations, and the pie chart says 45% are going to the United States. All right, because that's predominantly where the opportunities are. It also says that 20% are going to Asiatic Russia. All right, and that's when Russia started to industrialize. That was under Alexander III and Nicholas II, and they built that Trans-Siberian Railway. That there was large tracts of people that were really struggling in the eastern sectors or western sectors of Russia that were moving eastward, looking for better opportunities. And then they show Argentina, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then Brazil being the other destinations, okay, for a variety of different reasons. Australia and New Zealand primarily for the same reasons they might be coming to the United States. Okay, yeah.
It's like kind of off topic, but it relates to it. So, with my dad's side of the family, like the Sukonic side, they were Jewish, so they immigrated from Russia to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And then I met this girl named Julia Sukonic, whose family immigrated from Russia to Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
We also have some family in Argentina.
In Argentina, yeah.
You?
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Okay. The other thing is that they do in this chapter is they spend obviously a lot of the time on the European end of immigration, but then they also look at the Asian end of immigration, and there are different stories to be told there. All right. I always compared European immigration kind of to like gang initiation. All right. There's certain things that you have to put up with, like some episodes of, brutality, in order to prove that you're tough enough to hack it, right? And it seems like if you looked at like an Irish or a German or an Italian or even the Baltic states like Lithuanian or Latvian or Ukrainian experiences, that at some point you could look at the first few decades of the immigrant experience in America and it was awful. And then at some point, maybe after a generation or two, it seems like there was like a tacit acceptance of those groups into American society. That didn't happen with the Asians. All right. For the most part, it took a long time, if it happened at all. And sadly, if you look at Japanese experiences or Chinese experiences in America, it was usually like almost an indentured servitude. Or slave labor. And we know that to be true, especially because most of the Pacific side of the railway systems that were set up in America were set up by Chinese laborers. All right, and that was virtually slave labor. And then if they somehow survived it, then they tried to set up, to become American, to inhabit cities and build schools and set up businesses. And it seems like just as they made a transition to start building those apparatuses to become, realize the American dream, there were attacks that were carried out against those communities. And usually when you see racial tensions or ethnic tensions, they get exacerbated in times of economic distress. And so there is a section in the reading that is about nativism and when nativism happens. Okay, bless you. Nativism tends to happen in times that, at least perceptually, they're taking our jobs. Okay, whenever that happens to be. So if the post-gold, mining, the whatever you want to call it, post-gold rush California, as those folks are trying to get acclimated into what it's like to settle in Californian society, it starts to clash with Japanese immigrants also trying to settle in some of the western coast regions, or the Chinese laborers who were then, a generation or two removed from that experience trying to settle in those regions. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happened on the tail end of it. The only difference is that the United States actually legislated against those groups. Right? It's one of the saddest, badges of dishonor there's ever been. I mean, we've got Japanese internment. I mean, we got a lot, but Japanese internment was up there. But that was war related. But the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, seriously. And then Australia kind of mimicked a lot of what the United States was doing in terms of its racist-based discrimination against immigrant groups. They actually had this thing called the Great White Walls, which I kind of find unique in this time and day when we're talking about the Great White Walls. But that was literally like a forbidden kind of no immigrants are allowed from these regions to come to the United States. So back when we had shithole countries, they actually had that as part of a legislative action in the United States and also Australia and New Zealand. It's a great episode. But if you look at the end of immigration, you can look at that. There's also some good first-hand accounts. I include this stuff in your reading, and I wanted to show you where this is. But if you go into miscellaneous, and there's a section on the age of imperialism, there's one that's in here that is about Ellis Island and migration, and kind of talks about the different entry places or what it's like to be an immigrant coming into Ellis Island. Well, the California or the Pacific end of that was called Angel Island, and so they tried to at least bring both of those and then kind of give you an overview of what this big period of immigration was like. And there's a bunch of other stuff that's in there as well for you to look at, including a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about now. Like when it says Zulu Wars handout, you should take a look at that because I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Stanley and Livingstone, that's another thing that comes up. Remember yesterday I was talking about the letter that was sent by the Chinese political dignitaries to Queen Victoria, letting them know about the Opium Wars, or the opium sales. Let's see if there's anything else that's in there. No, that's good for now. All right, so the notes that I was talking about, if you open those up, and then the big thing is that I want you to go to miscellaneous resources and pull, actually to go to a section called maps. And I want you at least today to grab the one that says Map of Africa. So if you have the ability to open that, because a lot of what we're going to do, and that's also for the videotape because you probably cannot see that. So if you're watching at home, you want to go into your folder and make sure that you pull out this map so that at least when I'm explaining it and it looks like I'm talking to a blank piece of screen, you'll know what I'm kind of talking about. All right, but this is crucial because this is sort of the apex of the age of imperialism, was what they called the scramble for Africa. There's a lot of other things that are going on, and there's another map to at least show you where Europeans got involved in Asia. But it was nothing as complete as literally taking over a continent and annexing it as a political territory and doing that inside of 20 years. But that's what occurred in Africa. Okay, so I wanted to talk at least about some of the characters that were involved in that story, and then talk about a highlight of at least a few of the conflicts that occurred in that region. All right, so just kind of keep this in mind, or at least picture it. But outside of a couple of territories right here, a couple of little slivers on the the west side and the east side, that the Portuguese had kind of established settlements as early as the 1500s. Remember the Zinga Miamba story that I keep telling you about? Well, that eventually formed what they called the Congo Kingdom. Congo spelled with a K. That had a very small inroad right about here that the Portuguese had settlements. Okay? But for the most part, you don't see European settlements in Africa. All right? Part of it was the inability to be able to penetrate the interior of Africa was based on technology, but it was also based on disease. It was based on the incapacity for the European to be able to combat malaria. Was half of the reason that they we're staying away. The mosquitoes are too freaking bad. All right, but the one settlement that there was, all right, besides the slave depots and a couple of trade states that were developed along the Indian Ocean side, was a region called Cape Colony. So who first controlled Cape Colony or settled there? The Dutch. That's right. So remember the golden age of the Netherlands. What time period is that? Mid-17th. So say circa 1650. You guys should remember that, okay? Because somehow on the board exam that will become important. All right. The golden age of the Netherlands is mid-17th century. So circa about 1657, the Dutch settled in this region and named it Cape Colony. All right. And then eventually when the British said, I think we're going to run around the world and steal everything the Dutch have, all right, that was one of the territories they got. Besides like New Amsterdam becoming New York and the British East India Company replacing the Dutch East India Company, they eventually took over Cape Colony. And when they did, the settlement of the Dutch got pushed into the interior. Okay? And so when you hear about that group, they come in a couple of different forms. The first is that they're called the Boers. B-O-E-R-S. These are descendants of the Dutch that settled in the southern tip of Africa that eventually became almost like American pioneers, that rather than going westward, they were going northward. All right? But it's the same story. As the Dutch got pushed further and further into the interior, they had a Plains Indian experience. Okay? But instead of Plains Indians, it was known as the Bantu peoples, which were, 1,000-year-old migratory tribes that had gone from this region up here at the very bottom of the Congo on down and had basically followed herds. All right, they were hunters, and they followed the migration patterns of the animals, and they more or less, this wasn't property ownership, this was just people living. All right, so they never came into conflict with white Europeans before, but that started as they started to push northward, then they had those encounters. So it's very similar to when American settlers started to get in their little covered wagons and go through the plains, and then they would run into all of these well-established tribes that are like, yo, what are you doing here? We don't want you here. All right, and so what ended up happening was conflicts between these different tribes and the Boer republics, or the Boers, as they started to get settlements northward. All right, and as the British got a little antsy throughout the 19th century, they were starting to move in. And guess what? It's the same kind of crap. When you had westward expansion, it was based on a variety of factors, but one of them was, in the United States, was gold rush, right? That was one of the impetuses to get people to start westward expansion. There's gold in them there hills, right? So then they fight the Indians, exterminate them, or screw them out of their land treaty style, so that they can gold prospect. Same thing here, except that it was a combination of gold prospecting and also diamond prospecting. Okay, so those settlements became very lucrative. All right. And then there's battles. And there are the few battles that you actually saw where native Africans would take on, militarized Europeans over who controls what territory. But the results were the same. Okay? The Plains Indians eventually were not going to have a chance against the militarized American armies that are trying to take over those territories. Same goes for some of really the most militarily organized groups of African fighters. Has anybody ever heard of the Zulus or the Zulu Nation? Okay, they're like Crazy Horse, and that group, like the really organized Sioux warriors that were fighting against American, what's his name, Custer and the gang. All right, so you had those kind of fights. Yeah.
You know a tribe called Quest?
Yes.
Q-Tip's always talking about the Zulu Nation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know Q-Tip, but that's cool. All right. But yeah, they are the heroes, really, of whatever African resistance there was to European intrusion. that some of the hardest fights that they had were the British fighting against the Zulu or the Xhosa tribes, or the Boer people fighting against the Zulus or the Xhosa tribes. And they had their crazy horses. They had people like Shaka Zulu, or they had people like Dinga Shwayo or King Ketchwayo. If you read that handout, it'll kind of give you some of those stories. Very organized, great infantry, unbelievable fighters, but fighting against Maxim machine guns. Okay? It doesn't matter how good you are and how skilled you are. When you're fighting against that preponderance of firepower, it's not going to be much of a fight after a while. And that's unfortunately what ends up happening. Okay? So there is periodic wars, a lot of them in the 1870s. But eventually, the Boers get really established settlements in this region right up here. Okay? And they were called the Boer Republics. One of them was called the Orange Free State, and the other was called Transvaal. All right? And then so the story will continue, and eventually we get to a place where it's not the Europeans fighting against native Africans, it's the Europeans fighting against other Europeans. And for the most part, the contests in Africa, because yesterday we talked about China and Japan and very well organized and long established, empires that were now facing the onslaught of European imperialism, and we're having a hard time holding up. It's not going to be much of a contest here for the reasons that we mentioned. Okay? And most of the time what we ended up getting here was when Europeans would trip over other Europeans that were trying to gain control over territories. Okay? So let's go to the notes really quick, because this becomes the centerpiece of a lot of this story, is this region called the Congo. And the efforts by King Leopold II to conquer that territory and to turn it into a cash cow, but also to turn it into, look how big my empire is. Because Belgium is it's a tiny little place, man. All right, a lot of people don't take Belgium seriously. Has anybody watched that? Who's that British comedian that has the HBO show?
Yeah.
Who is it?
John Oliver.
Yeah, always makes fun of Belgium. Yeah. So anyway, Leopold sees this as an opportunity to kind of put Belgium on the map so that Belgium would be taken seriously. The territory that they end up getting is like 64 times the size of Belgium. All right, it was insane, this acquisition. And early on, like I said, there's not a lot of people that have ever been where some of these folks were going to go. So there is an exploration element to this. All right, and one of the people that really got it started was a missionary by the name of David Livingstone, and you can read about it. It's kind of like folklore-ish almost. That here's this man that supposedly is like the first white man to ever see certain things. Like areas of the Congo or the Congo River Basin or the Victoria Falls or whatever it got renamed in, modern day Kenya. All right, he was the one that got to see all those things, and there were transmissions where he was actually like talking about it, and it was piquing people's curiosity, kind of like Marco Polo style. All right, and then all of a sudden it was like Livingstone. After a while, it went to radio silence. So they were under the impression that Livingstone probably died, or whatever the case was, that they lost communication with him. So they eventually sent this journalist dash explorer dash adventurer, whatever you want to call him, to find Livingstone, and his name was Henry Stanley. All right, and so that's the great story. That's the Stanley that ultimately gets kind of heralded as this great figure in European history, because he's the one that finally found Livingstone. And there's this famous phrase where he says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And it's very English. Although Henry Stanley was not English. He was American, but he was posing as an Englishman, sort of. All right. Anyway, the darker side of Stanley is that they formed this business that was more or less backed by King Leopold II of Belgium, to go and expand. All right. to formulate treaties, like to do, what people do, which is to take advantage of folks that don't realize that they might be, signing off millions of acres of land before they know what the hell happened. But that's what Stanley and his crew was ultimately to do, was to screw some African chiefs out of millions of acres of land and then conquer it and then turn it into a cash cow. And so there was, obviously there was a massive demand for rubber. And so it turns out that is a big resource in the Congo, among other things. So there's this desire to extract rubber. And they ended up putting a lot of folks into business in that regard. Henry Stanley starts bringing traders in, and then they're going to build the Congo into this massive rubber export industry. But what they don't tell you is the means in which they do it. Okay, and that's the story that is maybe the worst episode in genocide, at least in modern history, is what ends up taking place in the Congo. All right, that they ultimately virtually enslaved the populations, and then they put quotas on, some of them are like kids, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids that are now to go into the forests and extract rubber, and if they don't come back with a certain amount, then they're going to be punished. And how did they punish them? They cut off their hands. Okay? And then every once in a while, so you would go and you'd see these photographs, because eventually they had photographs of kids in the Congo, and they would pose, and you'd see that one of them would be missing their right hand, or one of them would be missing their left hand. Can you just, subvert that somehow?
It's Kelly Johnson.
Yeah, just ask whatever she wants. But anyway, back to the story. And yeah, there was even people that would be in charge. I don't know, you want to call them middle management or something like that. And that in order to show that they were being adequately disciplined, they would have to periodically just show up with a bag of hands. All right, so that they could arbitrarily go and then say, among these workers, we have to chop off 20 people's hands because I've got to show my higher up that I mean business. So they'd show up with a bag of just random people's hands or their arms and produce them, basically just pour them out on the ground and say, yeah, we had a tough day in the field. We really had to bust ass, but we did.
Okay.
All right, and we got people to work harder.
Sounds good. Just bring them over to you.
Okay, so you started to get those stories eventually, and like I said, it took people to witness or people to write about it, and eventually that's where we start to get at least some activism to say Leopold is committing genocide in Africa. All right, and enough people told tales. One of them was Joseph Conrad. All right, eventually told tales about what was taking place, but nothing happened there until they realized that they probably killed about 20 million people. All right. So when we look at how the Amerindian populations were decimated in Hispaniola and other places, so that they could find silver that wasn't there, the same similar circumstance happened in Africa. So what's odd about it is that you have this rising humanitarianism in Europe is juxtaposed with the cruelest forms of exploitation that you've ever heard about that are happening in Africa and Asia. Okay. So there's some other figures that are involved in these stories, and their stories are just as bad. Cecil Rhodes is one of those figures that you'll read about. He's the founder of the De Beers Trading Company, which is the largest diamond prospecting company in the world. Still is a big diamond exporter. All right. Has everybody heard of blood diamond? Yes. All right. So you're familiar with the fact that this is an industry that started a very, very long time ago, when elites started to get an appetite for diamonds, and now you got to fill that appetite. So some of the things that we saw in the Congo are getting duplicated in diamond mines in South Africa and elsewhere. And if there was any kind of resistance, like I said, it would be destroyed because there was an increase in communication. Now they have telegraphs and other forms of being able to communicate. Oh, there's this uprising, we need to be able to get ships here immediately. Or they roll out the Maxim machine guns, or whatever the case may be. But they're able to hold order pretty well without a lot of effective resistance. Okay, I told you about Zulu and Xhosa. There was one where there was an uprising against the Germans in Southwest Africa. And so you'll read, or at least Google it, but it could be one of your PSDs, but read about the Herero massacre. I mean, they literally wiped out an entire tribe of people that were fighting against German imperialism. Okay. The other one was, let me go back to the map here, and you can kind of see it. This is kind of just like who did what where. All right. And you can obviously see that, I told you yesterday that Egypt eventually caught wind of the fact that Britain was slowly but surely taking over the country. And by the time, Egyptian nationalists started to recognize that Egyptian leadership was a puppet leadership and that Britain was pulling the strings, and they fought, that the British came in and just kind of mowed down that resistance and then formally occupied them as a colony. All right. They also, British had Cape Colony, which we know, and there's a famous picture of Cecil Rhodes that is straddling the entire continent of Africa, with his top foot on Cairo and his bottom foot on Cape Town. That the dream was to literally take the entire half of Africa and put it under British control. And you could see that they damn well almost did it. All right, by the time it's said and done. All right. And after they got done conquering Egypt, they started moving into the modern day Sudan. And that was the other place where there was at least some kind of native uprising to stop it. And it happens in this region called Khartoum. All right, and you'll read about it, the Battle of Khartoum. It's like Little Bighorn. It's like one of the few places where there was something that at least natives could high five themselves and say, "Yeah, we stopped it." Okay, but we know that after Little Bighorn, what's the place in South Dakota? What am I thinking of? 1890, the big massacre. Yeah, the Indian
the Battle of
thing.
Little Bighorn.
Little Bighorn was
A year ago.
that was a victory.
Yes, I think you really know.
Yeah. Wounded Knee.
Wounded Knee, thank you. Yes, Wounded Knee.
Yes.
So there's going to be a Wounded Knee to replace Bighorn here. All right, Khartoum is where a British expeditionary force was eventually surrounded, and they laid siege to this group. And there was this decorated general, his name was Gordon, that had his troops. And it caused this big stir in the British Parliament. They were fighting over, they were talking about why Britain was there in the first place. So there's pro-imperialists and anti-imperialists. And eventually they're like, that's not the question. The question is, we've got a whole bunch of our people that are surrounded. How are we going to be able to save them? And before they finally made a decision on what they were going to do, they got massacred. Okay, and Gordon died. And so the British were like, well, that's not cool. We're probably going to have to avenge that. So they brought in this guy named Horatio Kitchener that went in and kind of picked up in the Sudan, where the pieces were left, and eventually engaged this group. They were led by this guy named the Mahdi. It means guided one. But it was a predominantly Muslim resistance against the Europeans in the Sudan. And eventually the Sudanese rebels were concentrated in this region called Omdurman. And they had a battle there. This time the British were ready. And so what happened? You'll read about it. I think the battle casualty statistics were 11,000 Sudanese deaths and 28 British. So 11,000 to 28. And one of the first-hand witnesses of it, because it was literally, one group's got machine guns, the other group has got spears. All right, that's not really a fair fight. And so one of the guys that was kind of sitting on the hill was a young officer. His name was Winston Churchill, who was accounting just how awful that was to watch. Where you're literally just training machine guns at people that are literally running into the machine gun fire. But by the time it gets settled, ultimately, so the British are successful. They've now occupied all of this territory, and then they start moving further south. The only other things that you're going to read about in this section are going to be when Europeans are running into other Europeans. And so Henry Stanley and his International Congo Association has effectively occupied a whole bunch of territory around the Congo River Basin, but then also the French have been sending in their explorers to try to occupy some of the Congo River Basin. Everybody's hearing about how rich it is and how potentially profitable it's going to be. So everybody wants a piece. And eventually Henry Stanley's crew ends up encountering this guy named Pierre de Brazza. And they're like, hey, I screwed this African chief out of this land. He's like, wait, we screwed this African chief out of his land. And they're like, well, we screwed him first. And then so they end up having this big battle. And then that's the point where Bismarck is like, wait a second, kids. We are not going to start a major European war over a bunch of territory in the middle of Africa. So everybody come to Berlin and we'll sit down and we'll make ground rules. Okay. We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure that you guys get this. Read about the Berlin Conference. It literally sets up the rules for how they're going to scramble around and get Africa. Okay. Even cool things like they decide that the Belgians will get control of the Congo, but they'll allow for other European states to be able to trade there freely. That was one of the compromises. The second one, though, was they call it effective occupation, where anybody that's ever played the game Shotgun, so you know what Shotgun is?
What's that?
You go outside of the store and you and your brother or sister yell, "Shotgun!"
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right? That's literally what this is. You have to call it. All right? You can't sit in Paris and say, we want Morocco. You actually have to be in Morocco to declare it Morocco. So it's like the shotgun rules, except for taking over an entire continent. Yeah.
It's so disgusting that they just got around and said what can we take from these people? Well, they're just so entitled.
Yeah, and they did, and I imagine that the African representation at the Berlin Conference of 1884 was not so strong.
Yeah.
All right. So you can notice right here, Liberia, which was a territory that was parceled off for slaves, former slaves that could, what do you call it, repatriate back to Africa, and then Ethiopia. They got a W. It's the only state, really, that got a W in a battle against Europeans. They took on the Italians and lost in 1896. That's why Mussolini was so excited about the prospect of taking over Ethiopia in 1935, because they were going to avenge that big L that the Ethiopians hung on them in 1896. Two other things to read about. One of them is called the Fashoda crisis. It really isn't much. But it was when Horatio Kitchener's people ran into more French people that were trying to occupy the same territory, and then they worked it out. And one of the compromises was the French will yield on that side if the British will support the French in Morocco. And Morocco becomes the scene of one of the things that led to World War I. So it is kind of important to pay attention to. And then the last thing is the Boer War, which is where the British knew that there was these awesome mines in the Boer republics, and so they went. There was this guy named Leander Jameson that made a raid in Boer territory, and the leader of the Boer territories says, "No, that's not cool," and so they ended up going to war, and the British and the Boers ended up battling, and it was really bad publicity for the British because it made them look like bullies. All right. But between 1899 and 1902, there's this thing called the Boer War. And it ended up draining a lot of resources. And like I said, it was bad publicity for the British. But ultimately the settlement was South Africa. They created the Union of South Africa. And they didn't expel, nobody got expelled, even though the British won. They ended up creating the Union of South Africa. And it kind of brought British settlers and then Boer settlers together. Sorry, that's a tough way to go. After that, apartheid. And that's where a small minority of folks were able to control a large majority of folks. So they kind of Jim Crowed the South African black population, except, like I said, the black population in South Africa was like 85%.
Right.
So a little different than the Jim Crow here, but it's the same concept. Okay. And that lasted until the early 90s, because when I was in college, that was one of the cool protests that we got to have, was divesting in South Africa until they changed their apartheid regime. Yeah.
I saw an interview with one of the guys from Duck Dynasty, and he said that he thought black people were better off under Jim Crow in America.
He did.
He's like, I used to hear them be singing their songs. They were doing just fine. I could not believe what I was
Yeah, I
reading.
think he spoke at the Republican National Convention.
Yeah.
No, I'm not kidding.
Opened it.
He opened it. That's right. He was there. So, God bless him. All right. So, yeah, we can stop time. Is Joni still here? Okay, if you just hit stop.